You're standing in a shallow depression in the Talheim Valley of southwestern Germany. The year is 5000 BCE. The air smells of damp earth and something sharper, something metallic. Below you, 34 people are being rolled into a pit. Men, women, 16 children. They weren't killed in a fair fight. They were executed from behind with stone adzes, skulls shattered while they were kneeling, hands bound, faces in the dirt. According to the version of history you were taught in school, this shouldn't be happening. Pre-civilized man was the noble savage, too few in number for organized massacre, too connected to nature for systematic cruelty, too primitive for anything this deliberate. Yet here you are, looking at the first documented death pit in human history, and it is not the last. Look, Nom, I have a take on this. I want to be upfront about where I'm standing before we go any further. I came into this research wanting to believe that violence is a modern invention, a product of cities and kings and greed, something that arrived with agriculture and property and the first standing armies. After 18 months inside the primary evidence, the excavation logs, the forensic bioarchaeology, the ancient DNA papers that don't make it into the documentaries, I don't believe that anymore. I think our ancestors were capable of things that would make a modern soldier look away. I think the darkness we carry isn't a corruption of something originally innocent. I think it came with us, built in, from the very beginning. I've tried to follow the evidence honestly, but you should know where I'm standing. Mandidu, I was at the dentist, sitting in the waiting room, just flicking through a paper on my phone to kill time before the cleaning. And I came across a scan of a femur from the Atapuerca Mountains in Spain. A bone from a species called Homo antecessor, dating back 800,000 years. It had clear intentional butchery marks, not from an animal, from a stone tool used to strip the meat from the bone. I remember going very still in that plastic chair. The realization landing, not as a thought, but as a physical thing, that cannibalism isn't a breakdown of society. For the beings who came before us, for the lineage that produced us, it was something closer to a default, a baseline, not an aberration from some prior innocence, but evidence that the innocence was never there to begin with. I still had the dentist to get through. I couldn't think about anything else. What history books left out, and what mainstream archaeology has been slow to say plainly, is that the prehistoric record is saturated with evidence of organized, deliberate, large-scale human violence, not scattered incidents, not anomalies. A pattern, recurring across cultures, continents, and hundreds of thousands of years, with a consistency that is very hard to explain away. These are 10 of the sites that pattern runs through, and none of them should have happened. 1. The cannibal feast of Grandolina, Spain, 800,000 years ago, before the Great Flood, before Homo sapiens existed, before anything we recognize as civilization had taken even its earliest shape. In the Grandolina cave of the Atapuerca Mountains, archaeologists found the remains of at least 6 individuals. The bones weren't simply discarded. No, they were processed, cracked open for marrow, stripped of flesh with the same precision applied to deer and bison in the same layer of sediment. Cut marks placed with deliberate accuracy at the points of maximum meat yield. Here's what makes researchers uncomfortable. This wasn't a starvation event. There was no evidence of resource collapse in the valley. Game was available. The caloric need wasn't desperate enough to explain what happened here. This was a choice. Eudald Carbonell and colleagues at the University of Rovira, Paint Virgili, publishing in the Journal of Human Evolution, identified the processing as consistent with what they termed gastronomic cannibalism, meaning consumption not driven by famine, but by preference or ritual. The clinical language creates a certain distance. It shouldn't. What it means is this: andapt, For nearly 1 million years before us, human-like species looked at each other and saw a resource, not a prohibition, not a boundary. A caloric option, processed with the same efficiency applied to any other available animal. The villain here isn't a person or a culture or a failing institution. It's the biological hardware we've spent the last 10,000 years trying to overwrite. And the question I kept coming back to, sitting with this evidence, is whether we've actually overwritten it, or just learned to dress it differently. Matu 2. The Nataruk massacre, Kenya, 10,000 years ago. The shores of what was then a lagoon on the edge of Lake Turkana in Kenya. 10,000 years ago. A group of hunter-gatherers, no crops, no permanent settlement, no territory in any fixed sense, were killed in a coordinated attack that left 12 skeletons in the silt. 10 of the 12 show clear evidence of a violent death: clubbed skulls, stone arrowheads embedded in knee joints and neck vertebrae, impact positions consistent with people who were running or kneeling when they were struck, a pregnant woman, her hands and feet in a position suggesting binding, her unborn child's bones preserved in the sediment beside her. Marta Mirazon-Lar and colleagues at Cambridge published the Nataruk findings in Nature in 2016. The response from mainstream archaeology was careful, measured, almost reluctant, because Nataruk dismantles the most comfortable version of the violence origin story. The standard account says war began with farming, that once we had land to defend and surplus to protect, violence became organized and lethal. Before that, conflict existed, but it was opportunistic, personal. Not this. These people had no land, no surplus, no territory worth organizing a raid to take. They were killed for the sake of elimination. The real reason the Nataruk findings generated such careful academic language is that they push organized, lethal violence back to a point where none of the comfortable explanatory frameworks apply. No property, no hierarchy, no state, no structural incentive that civilization could be blamed for producing. Just the decision to kill everyone in the group across the water, before we even had a word for war. 3. The Herxheim ritual disassembly, Germany, approximately 5000 BCE. You need to understand something before we go further. The sites I'm covering aren't simply fights. They aren't raiding parties that got out of hand or desperate violence in a bad season. Some of them are engineered events, organized with a precision and a consistency that looks from this distance less like primitive chaos and more like dark bureaucracy. Herxheim is the clearest example, a site in the Rhine Valley of Germany, excavated between 1994 and 2008 by Andrea Zieblans and colleagues. At its center, 2 roughly oval ditches surrounding a settlement, and inside those ditches, the fragmented, processed remains of at least 500 people, possibly as many as 1,000. The bones weren't buried. They were disassembled, defleshing marks, marrow extraction, on a skulls modified into vessels, cranial vaults with the facial bones removed and the edges carefully smoothed. Zieblans' team documented the processing as systematic, consistent, and repeated not once, but across a period of approximately 250 years. This was a practice, maintained and organized across generations. Isotopic analysis of the bone chemistry established that the individuals whose remains ended up in the Herxheim ditches came from a wide geographic area. They were not all local. They were brought there, or they traveled there, from the mountains, from the coast, from hundreds of kilometers away. Something drew them, and whatever it was, it put them in the ditches. Before I go further, let me explain something. There's a concept worth naming here. It's called the Overton window, the range of ideas that the academic mainstream considers acceptable to discuss at any given moment. The reason this matters for Herxheim is that the official framing keeps the site inside a particular interpretive window. Funerary ritual, ancestor veneration, culturally specific mortuary practice, because the alternative framing is outside the range of what archaeology is currently comfortable publishing in its most prominent journals. The alternative is that Herxheim was a cult site of organized killing, that the processing of hundreds of people over 2.5 centuries, drawing participants from across Central Europe, represents a degree of ideological coordination and institutional structure that doesn't fit the timeline we've been taught. Modern analogy. A Wikipedia article about a disputed event is shaped by whoever writes and edits it most consistently. The Overton window in any field works the same way. The range of interpretations that gets published most loudly shapes what the rest of the world believes is settled. Herxheim is not settled. The reason this matters is that when the window moves, and it is moving slowly, the way it moved after Göbekli Tepe forced a revision of the Neolithic timeline, the Herxheim evidence is going to read very differently than it currently does in the textbooks. 4. The Lost Children Beneath the Stones, Bolivia and Beyond. Various periods. Mainstream archaeology loves to talk about the precision of Puma Punku, the H-blocks, the tolerances, the mystery of the transport routes. They talk less about what was found in the sediment beneath foundation stones at comparable Andean ceremonial sites. Infants, deliberately interred beneath construction at the moment of building. Foundational ritual deposits, as the excavation language calls them. A clinical phrase for what it actually describes. The burial of a child so the structure would stand. I actually laughed when I first read the official report from a comparable site. Not because it was funny, because the language was so deliberately flattening. Foundational ritual deposit. I had to read it 3 times before I accepted what it was describing. This practice was not isolated to the Andes. Child sacrifice as foundation offering appears in the archaeological record across Mesopotamia, the Levant, Sub-Saharan Africa, Bronze Age Europe, and pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. That not as a fringe aberration in each culture, but as a repeated, documented, institutionally organized practice. At Megiddo in Israel, excavations uncovered infant remains beneath the floors of Bronze Age buildings across multiple construction phases. In Carthage, the Topet, a sacrificial precinct, contained the cremated remains of thousands of infants and young children. Here's what the mainstream history of religion would prefer you not sit with too long. The people who built the most enduring monuments of the ancient world, the structures we photograph and document and marvel at, built them on the premise that a child's death was a reasonable price for permanence. The villain here is the institutional voice, the language that translates a crime into a cultural practice, a ritual into a deposit, and a child into an offering, and in doing so, places it at a comfortable analytical distance from what it actually was. The stones still stand. The children are still beneath them. 5. The Green Sahara and the Great Drying, North Africa, approximately 6,000 to 2,000 BCE. We look at the Sahara today and see emptiness, sand, a wasteland stretching 3,000 miles. 10,000 years ago, it was green, lakes, rivers, grasslands, a population of hundreds of thousands living across what is now the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. The African humid period, the Green Sahara, lasted roughly 8,000 years, from approximately 11,000 to 3,000 BCE. During that time, the region supported agriculture, fishing, pastoralism, and communities whose sophistication the desert later buried completely. And then the water vanished, not overnight, over centuries. The intertropical convergence zone shifted. The monsoon rains retreated south. Lake by lake, river by river, the Sahara dried. The population compressed toward the remaining water sources. The atrocity isn't the climate change. It's what the skeletal record from the Gobero burial site in Niger, one of the largest prehistoric cemeteries ever found in the Sahara, excavated by Paul Serino and colleagues and published in 2008, shows happening in the final centuries of the Green Sahara's collapse. A measurable spike in interpersonal violence, healed and perimortem fractures indicating repeated blunt trauma. Individuals buried with injuries consistent with organized conflict rather than individual altercation. Now, I've spent time in the primary excavation logs from this period, the ones that don't make it into the documentaries. And what the mainstream framing consistently avoids is the evidence for what appears to be coordinated defensive architecture in settlements that were supposedly too socially simple to have needed it. The mounds weren't just for living, they were for watching. If you are half listening to this while doing something else, I need you to actually stop for this next part, because this is the piece that ties everything else together. The Green Sahara collapse is a template, a test case for what happens to human behavior when the resource base contracts by even a significant fraction. The answer the Gobero evidence gives is not the noble deterioration of a peaceful people into reluctant conflict. It's the rapid, unorganized activation of violence as a survival mechanism, the same mechanism that operates at Talheim, at Crow Creek, at Nataruk, the same mechanism that, if the climate projections for the next 50 years are accurate, several regions of the planet are currently moving toward. This isn't ancient history in any meaningful sense. It's a preview. Macatees 6, the Crow Creek Culling, South Dakota, approximately 1325 CE, 486 people, found in a fortification ditch near the Missouri River in South Dakota. Long before any European presence in North America. Every age group, both sexes, killed, mutilated, and deposited with a thoroughness that left almost no ambiguity about intent. P. Willey's forensic analysis, published in 1990, documented the physical evidence in clinical detail. Over 90% of the skulls show evidence of scalping. 32% show perimortem fractures, bone damage at or near the time of death. Evidence of tongue removal on multiple individuals. Hands and feet severed after death. Bodies partially defleshed before deposit. This was not a battle. Battles leave a different kind of evidence. Injuries consistent with active combat, with people who were fighting back. Crow Creek's injury patterns are consistent with people who were restrained, executed, and processed. This was a culling. I was reading the full excavation report at about 2 in the morning on a Tuesday. I was going to write this section arguing that ancient peoples were more spiritually sophisticated than modern violence gives them credit for, but that the atrocities were the exception and the ceremonial complexity was the rule. The Crow Creek data made that argument impossible to finish. Because here's what the evidence around the massacre shows. The victims were already suffering. Skeletal markers of malnutrition. Growth arrest lines in the bone indicating repeated starvation events. Signs of chronic drought stress in the population record going back decades before the massacre. The Missouri River Valley in the late 13th century was experiencing a mega drought, competing populations compressed into shrinking fertile corridors along the river. Resource competition that had probably been manageable for generations became unsurvivable, and someone made a decision, not in a moment of passion. The scale and organization of what happened at Crow Creek requires planning, coordination, a command structure capable of mobilizing enough people to kill 486 in a single event. The mainstream explanation calls it resource conflict, intergroup violence driven by environmental pressure. That is almost certainly correct. But here is what that actually means. Strip away the archaeological language, and what you have is a community that looked at a neighboring group of malnourished people already dying slowly, and decided to finish it. Organized, deliberate, complete. We didn't learn this from civilization. We brought it with us. 7. The bog bodies of the pre-flood Northern Europe, 3000 BCE to 300 CE. They come out of the peat looking almost alive. Tolen man, Graubala man, Lindo man, Wide girl are hundreds of bodies preserved by the acidic chemistry of Northern European bogs, some dating back 5,000 years, skin intact, hair intact, last meals still identifiable in preserved stomach contents, and almost universally killed. The manner of death documented across the bog body corpus goes beyond execution. Tulin Man was hanged. Graubalaman had his throat cut ear to ear with enough force to nearly sever the spine. Lindo Man was struck on the skull twice, strangled, and had his throat cut. A triple death that researchers have identified across multiple bog body cases, suggesting a ritual formula rather than simple killing. P.V. Glob's foundational study published in 1969 and subsequent forensic work by Don Brothwell and colleagues must established that many bog bodies show evidence of high-status diet before death, well-fed, well-maintained, some showing signs of manicured hands inconsistent with manual labor. These were not low-status individuals disposed of in a swamp. They were chosen. Here's where the mainstream interpretation and the evidence create a genuine tension. The official framing, ritualized execution, possibly of willing sacrificial victims, relies on a framework in which the killing is understood as religiously sanctioned and therefore categorically different from atrocity. But the ritual framing is the community's framing, not the victim's. The triple death applied to Lindo Man, the redundancy of it, 3 killing methods when one would suffice, suggests not just ceremony, but a specific requirement for completeness. That the killing be total, are unambiguous, irreversible. What kind of theology requires you to kill the same person 3 ways? What kind of community produces it across 5,000 years of practice, from the Neolithic to the Roman Iron Age, with enough consistency to be recognizable as a tradition? The answer is that we don't fully know. And the gap between what the peat preserved and what it can tell us about the minds of the people who placed those bodies there is one I haven't resolved to my own satisfaction. But the bodies are real, and they keep coming out of the ground. 8. The drowned villages of Doggerland, North Sea, approximately 8,000 to 6,000 BCE. Stand on the eastern coast of England and look out across the North Sea toward Denmark. What you're looking at isn't just water. It's a graveyard. A Doggerland, the landmass that connected Britain to continental Europe before rising sea levels, swallowed it between approximately 10,000 and 6,000 BCE, was home to a substantial Mesolithic population. Hunter-gatherer communities spread across river valleys, coastal lagoons, and wetland plains now sitting under 100 to 150 feet of water. We know they were there because their tools come up in fishing nets, bone harpoons, worked flint, animal remains, and occasionally, human bones. The Storegga Slide, a series of submarine landslides off the Norwegian coast, dated to approximately 6200 BCE, generated a tsunami that struck the coast of Doggerland with a wave height estimated by researchers at 10 to 20 meters. Mumberkey, a community living on a flat coastal plain with no high ground, would have had almost no time and nowhere to go. Here's what the history books left out. The people of Doggerland didn't just drown in a natural disaster. They had been living under increasing climate pressure for 2,000 years before the tsunami. Sea levels were rising steadily. The landmass they inhabited was shrinking generation by generation. The resource base was compressing. Research by Vincent Gaffney and colleagues at the University of Bradford, published in 2007, used seismic survey data to map the lost landscape. What the surveys show is a complex inhabited territory, not a few scattered nomads, but a populated world. A populated world that vanished. And within that vanishing, the same pattern the Gobero evidence shows in the Sahara, a not peaceful retreat, not orderly migration. The archaeological record of the North Sea transition period contains sites showing evidence of the same violent spike that appears wherever the resource base contracts sharply enough, fast enough. The tsunami finished what the slow drowning had already started. We don't have names for the people of Doggerland. We don't have their myths. We don't have their version of what was happening to them. We have their harpoons, pulled up by trawler nets in the middle of the North Sea, and the bones the nets miss. Mago 9. The Sacrifice at the Summit, Andean, South America. Approximately 1400 to 1500 CE. In 1999, at an elevation of 6,700 meters on Mount Lulailako in Argentina, archaeologists found 3 Inca children. A girl of approximately 15, a girl of approximately 6, a boy of approximately 7. They had been placed in separate chambers near the summit, dressed in elaborate textiles, surrounded by offerings, preserved by the altitude and the cold for 500 years, with a completeness that made the discovery feel less like archaeology and more like an interruption. The 15-year-old, known as the maiden, showed coca leaf and chicha alcohol in her system at levels consistent with sustained consumption over the final year of her life. She had been chemically sedated, progressively and deliberately, as the date of her death approached. Analysis by Andrew Wilson and colleagues published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2012 documented the metabolic evidence in detail. She was prepared for this, over months, with care, with ceremony, by people who believed completely in what they were doing. The Capacocha ritual, the Inca practice of sacrificing children at high-altitude sites during moments of imperial significance, the death of a Sapa Inca, a solar eclipse, a military victory, was not a secretive atrocity. It was a public institution, celebrated. The children selected were considered honored. Their families were compensated and elevated. Here's the question I can't resolve cleanly. Does institutional sanction change what something is? The maiden was killed, deliberately, by people who held her life in their hands and ended it for a purpose she did not choose. The ceremony around it, the preparation, the belief system that made it meaningful, these are real. They shaped the experience, and they gave it a frame. But she was 15 years old on a mountain in the cold, and she didn't come down. The distinction between atrocity and ritual is one the perpetrators always make. The victims rarely get to weigh in. And when we accept the institutional framing without question, when we call it ceremony and move on, we are doing what the academic language at Puma Punku did with the foundational deposits. We are translating a crime into a cultural practice and letting the translation do the ethical work we should be doing ourselves. 10. The Yamnaya replacement, Europe, approximately 3000 BCE. This is the one that doesn't have a single site. It has an entire continent. And it is the most disturbing entry on this list precisely because it is the most recent, the most thoroughly documented, and the most resistant to a comfortable explanation. Beginning around 3000 BCE, the genetic record of Europe undergoes a transformation of a scale and speed that physical archaeology alone could not explain, until ancient DNA analysis made it legible. David Reich's lab at Harvard, Wolfgang Hoch's team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. A series of papers published between 2015 and 2022 that collectively document something that rewrites the late Neolithic in terms that are genuinely difficult to read neutrally. Steppe pastoralists, Yamnaya culture people from the Pontic-Caspian, steppe north of the Black Sea, expanded west and north into Europe beginning around 3000 BCE. Within a few centuries, Yamnaya-related ancestry dominates the genetic record of Britain, Scandinavia, and large parts of Central Europe. The speed of this replacement is not the speed of cultural diffusion. It is not the kind of change produced by peaceful migration, blending gradually with existing populations over centuries. There is a specific data point I keep returning to and cannot walk away from. In the post-Yamnaya genetic record of Europe, the female line, mitochondrial DNA inherited maternally, shows significant continuity with the pre-existing farming populations. The Y chromosome, paternal inheritance, shows near total replacement in some regions. The women survived. the men did not. This pattern in the genetic record is consistent with one mechanism above almost all others. Conquest followed by systematic killing of the adult male population of the conquered group, the women and children incorporated into the expanding population. I can already see the comment someone is typing right now. But population replacement can happen through disease, not just violence. And they're not wrong that disease contributed to demographic collapse across multiple periods. But disease doesn't produce sex-specific replacement at the rates visible in this data. An epidemic doesn't selectively eliminate the male line while preserving the female line at population scale. The sex-specific pattern is the element that resists the disease explanation most strongly. Reich's own published writing is careful with this. He uses terms like migration and movement and acknowledges the violence interpretation without fully endorsing it. I understand why. The implications are significant. If the founding genetic layer of modern European populations was established through the systematic killing of the men of the previous culture and the absorption of their women, then the comfortable story of European prehistory, as a gradual cultural evolution, is not just incomplete. It is, at its genetic foundation, a story built on something we would call atrocity if it happened today. I almost wish I hadn't found this, because once you see what the Yamnaya data implies, once you map it against the Talheim pit and the Aspern-Schletz ditch, where the adult women are missing and the children are present alongside the men, you can't go back to the version of prehistory where this level of organized violence is the exception. You're stuck with it now, just like I am. Another 10 sites, 9,000 years, 5 continents, hunter-gatherers and pastoralists, and ceremonial cultures and proto-states, different weapons, different latitudes, different belief systems, same pattern. Grandolina's butchery marks on bones 800,000 years old. Nataruk's bound pregnant woman in the silt at Lake Turkana. Herxheim's skull bowls in the Rhine Valley ditches across 250 years. The foundational deposits beneath the stones of monuments we photograph and call mysterious. The Green Sahara's violence spike as the last lakes dried. Crow Creek's 486 in a fortification ditch on the Missouri. The bog bodies coming out of the northern peat with their triple deaths and their manicured hands. The drowned world of Doggerland pulled up in fishing nets. The maiden in her high-altitude chamber, unsedated across a year for a death she was prepared for but never chose. The Y chromosome near erasure written invisibly across 3,000 years of European genetics. This is what history books left out. Not because the evidence wasn't there, because the evidence doesn't fit the timeline we prefer. The official narrative needs us to believe that darkness arrived with civilization, that before the state, before the empire, before the army with its chain of command, humans lived in something closer to balance. The bones say otherwise. They have been saying it for a long time. The mainstream response to all of this is to call it pessimistic, cherry-picking, survivorship bias in reverse, selecting the dark sites from a record that contains plenty of evidence for cooperation, trade, care for the disabled and elderly, and genuine community. Well, that is true. Prehistoric humans cooperated. They built beautiful things. They cared for each other in ways the skeletal record also preserves. Healed injuries, the burial of the infirm, grave goods placed with tenderness across tens of thousands of years. They also did this. Both are true simultaneously, and the version that gets left out of the comfortable account is always the same one. What I keep running into, and cannot resolve, is this. We didn't just inherit their monuments. We inherited their ghosts. The same hardware that produced the Herxheim disassembly and the Crow Creek culling and the Yamnaya replacement is present in every human being alive today. Unmodified, running beneath the surface of every institution, every legal system, every social contract we've built to manage it. The question I've been sitting with since I started this research, and I'm not going to answer it because I don't think it can be answered cleanly, is whether those institutions are containing the hardware or simply providing it with better tools. If a more sophisticated version of us existed 12,000 years ago and ended up in mass pits and ritual ditches and fortification trenches, what makes us think our version of the story ends differently? There's a specific person you're thinking of right now. Someone who still holds the peaceful prehistory version. Someone who needs this evidence in front of them to decide for themselves. Send this to them, not to argue, because they deserve the same chance you just took. There's a question this video opened that it cannot answer. We've tracked the pattern of prehistoric violence across 9,000 years of evidence. What we haven't asked is the harder question on the other side of it. Why did some communities survive without evidence of massacre? What protected them? What made the difference? That question has an answer in the archaeological record. And it's not the one most people expect. Which ancient myth do you now suspect is a literal historical record of an atrocity? The destruction of Sodom, the fall of Atlantis, the flood itself? Tell me in the comments. And tell me whether you think the peaceful prehistory narrative survives contact with this evidence, or whether it was always just a story we needed to be true. I'll be reading. We didn't just inherit their monuments, we inherited their ghosts.